In honor of Sonic and Shadow Generations coming out later this year in October, I made a video tier listing the boss fights in Sonic Generations, the console versions to be exact. Many of you requested I do a part 2 on the 3DS bosses as well, so here we are. The footage in this video is not mine since I don't really have a way to record 3DS footage, but I'll credit the YouTubers who I used footage from in the description so you can check out their awesome gameplay and Sonic videos as well. So without further ado, let's rank these motherfuckers. Metal Sonic is our first rival fight out of 3, just like the PS3 and Xbox 360 versions of this game. Similar to the console versions, you take on Metal Sonic as Classic Sonic. Here, however, is a straight up race to the finish line, instead of trying to hit the boss X amount of times in order to win. Actually, all of the rival fights in the 3DS version of Sonic Generations are races instead of full-on battles. Metal Sonic retains his moveset from Sonic CD, using his electric shield if you fall behind, and his electric boost if you get too far ahead of him. The main difference here is that there are only specific sections of the stage that he'll use these moves on you instead of just being triggered upon the player's position, making it rather predictable here. The stage played on is Casinopolis for some strange reason, perhaps because Mecha Sonic from Sonic 2 first appeared in that game alongside Casinopolis. Regardless of the reason though, the stage is still set up similarly to Stardust Speedway from Sonic CD, in that there are floating platforms above the main stage to jump on in order to get an advantage over Metal Sonic in this race. If you have the homing attack equipped to Classic Sonic, it makes this rival fight a lot easier, as you can quickly pick up momentum by using it if you accidentally mess up or simply just need an extra speed boost. What's a bit cooler about this fight than the Metal Sonic race from Sonic CD is that you can sometimes damage Metal Sonic depending on what part of the stage you're on, making it feel a bit more like a boss fight than just an all-out race. I did like this boss fight, but it's definitely not the strongest one in this game. For me, I rank it in B tier primarily for Metal Sonic's predictability and being all too similar to the Sonic CD race without many changes or things added to spice things up. It's a fun little race, but it's definitely the weakest of the 3. Up next is Big Arm. Big Arm is technically the game's very first boss fight if you don't count the Metal Sonic rival race as a boss fight, and is technically Classic Sonic's first and only boss fight in the game if you don't count the Time Eater. Big Arm comes from Sonic 3's final boss and plays similarly to the original boss fight, but with some notable additions. Big Arm has more attacks, including actually using his arms to hit Sonic from 3 different positions, which will rotate the camera a bit if you do get hit, giving the fight a more 3-dimensional feel, which honestly looks good on the 3DS. It's possible to cheese this fight a bit and get multiple hits back to back on Big Arm, especially if you have the homing attack equipped as Classic Sonic. Actually, having the homing attack makes this boss fight incredibly easy, and you can beat it in under a minute if you're quick enough. It's not bad as the game's first boss fight, but it is rather easy to beat. I'm throwing this one in C tier though, since I'm not the biggest fan of it despite the added variety from the original fight. It just wasn't all that memorable for me as a boss fight in Sonic 3 or here in Sonic Generations, unfortunately. I guess it was kinda doomed to rank low with me from the start, so I do apologize if anyone really likes this boss fight. The second rival fight and third boss fight in this game is Shadow the Hedgehog. In the 3DS version of this battle, you race Shadow in Radical Highway as Modern Sonic, and it's actually a lot of fun here. First off, the sheer concept of racing Shadow and his first fully playable level from Sonic Adventure 2, that isn't a boss fight, just makes this challenge all the more significant. From the bridges to the highways to the platforming, Radical Highway was an excellent choice to use for this battle's backdrop. The 3DS really makes use of its 3D effects to create a beautiful parallaxing effect between the foreground, middle ground, and background, giving it a somewhat cinematic feel. Especially that the stage seems mostly all integrated within itself, and isn't like Sonic Colors with completely random blocks and shapes as platforms. Not to mention the camera angle changes that occur when you take various paths, though I do wish there was some rail grinding in this race. There are also plenty of shortcuts to take, which fills this race with replayability. Top that off with Shadow being more on the challenging side, boosting and using Chaos Spear in order to damage you throughout the stage, this fight immediately goes into A tier. Just like the Metal Sonic rival fight, this race is short and sweet, giving lots of incentive to play it over and over again in order to beat your high score and try out alternative routes to beat your fastest time. You can also damage Shadow occasionally, but I do wish there was a bit more feedback when this happens, such as a sound or something. Shadow can also damage you with his boost while you're already boosting, which I thought was a little weird, especially with the console version having both characters ricochet off each other. Nonetheless, I really dig this fight, or race, for what it is, and I'd say it's actually gotta be one of my favorite rival fights of all time. Up next is the Biolizard, which is the 4th boss fight in the game and technically Modern Sonic's first boss battle that he goes up against. This was a fantastic rendition of Shadow's boss fight against the Biolizard from SA2. What makes this such a great choice for a boss battle is that it translates so well from 3D to the 2.5D style of this game. The Biolizard's moveset is just about the same as the original boss fight and even has some cool additions added to it that fit right into the game's playstyle. For example, boosting when the Biolizard is chasing you with his tail or head works extremely well for when Shadow dealt with this in SA2. The slide mechanic also ports over flawlessly for when the Biolizard shoots his shadow balls at you to avoid. I normally don't care for 2D in my Sonic games, but they really nail it here with this boss fight. There's even a remastered phase at the end where Sonic is cast into the air, similar to Shadow, but instead must maneuver his way around the Biolizard's purple balls in a 3D maze type of space, and it was really cool switching to the analog stick to play this part since it changed things up a bit from the rest of the fight. While I do wish at some point the little river from Shadow's boss fight in SA2 opened up a bit to provide a bit more challenge, since in that game you really had to be aware of your surroundings, otherwise you'd fall in and get drifted away, for this being a boost game, I think it's still rather fine. The Biolizard lands an S tier for being such a great boss translated from my favorite Sonic game of all time to the 3DS, and also because it canonizes Sonic fighting the prototype of the Ultimate Lifeform, which we all know Shadow did on his own. Up next is Silver the Hedgehog, who is the final rival race and 5th boss fight in the game. Here you take on Silver as Modern Sonic in Tropical Resort? Okay, this was a little jarring since Silver never appears in the stage, but I'm guessing budget restraints and lack of time played a factor into this weird-ass decision. In this race, Shadow does not boost, but rather teleports near Sonic's position, making him a bit different from Metal Sonic and Shadow. Silver's only attack is about halfway through and near the end, where he'll throw boxes at you near the finish line, which could fuck up your entire run. As frustrating as this sounds though, I never really got all that annoyed with it since the rest of the race is pretty easy, and this provided some challenge, especially that after throwing the boxes, Silver recovers quickly, and it comes down to a neck and neck race between the two hedgehogs, which of course is such a great way to end things off on. I was pretty disappointed with the lack of variety and alternative paths in this one, especially with Metal Sonic's race seemingly having more of them, whereas Silver can kinda just magically teleport to your location regardless if you take them or not. I did still have fun replaying this race though to beat my fastest time and high score, so it wasn't all that bad. For me it ranks a B tier for the reasons already stated, and for having such a weird backdrop which doesn't make much sense canon-wise to the story of the game or Sonic's lore in general. Up next we have the Egg Empire from Sonic Heroes, which served as the standard final boss in everyone's story mode among the 4 teams you play as in that game. The main difference here though is that Sonic is fighting Eggman all on his own. In all, it's a pretty fun fight. There are 2 main phases to this boss. Phase 1 has Sonic chasing Eggman, as you have to dodge his slash attacks in order to reach him. He will either send a low slash, which you'll have to jump over, or a vertical slash, which you'll have to slide underneath. The closer you get to him, the harder it is to react to his attacks. Luckily, if you're boosting while you get hit, your boost will be cancelled out instead of losing rings. Phase 2 has you enter an arena-like area where Eggman is in the center and is surrounded by cannons. Your job is to use the homing attack on the cannons to launch a projectile at Eggman, which will piss him off so much that he'll destroy the cannon that shot at him. It's not as easy as it looks though, since the other cannons are also shooting at you, along with Eggman still slashing at you. Eggman's attacks and the other cannon's projectiles can also blow up the cannon you're trying to use to attack Eggman, so the easiest way to do this is to homing attack twice on a cannon and boost to a new one until Eggman goes after one of the cannons, in which you can boost over to Eggman and land a hit off of him. The final phase isn't much different, except Eggman's speed is drastically increased, and he basically goes berserk mode. His attacks come in bigger and faster, but I think they could have made this part a bit more challenging or notable, being that it's the last normal boss fight you face before the true final boss. I do think that the Egg Emperor translates really well as a boss fight from Sonic Heroes to the 3DS though, but its lack of alternative phases and challenge, especially with how difficult the original boss fight was in Heroes, makes this rank between A and B tier, so kinda in the middle. Though I can't really put this in the middle on here, just know it's somewhere but in here in the middle of A and B. And finally, last but not least, the true and final boss of the game, the Time Eater. After collecting all 7 Chaos Emeralds from the special stages, Eggman will reveal that with the brilliance of classic Eggman, the two teamed up to tame an entity known as the Time Eater, who was in a weaker state. The collaboration makes the two stronger than ever. Thankfully, classic Sonic is around and the two Hedgehogs enter in their super forms. You know, instead of also letting Shadow and Silver and Knuckles and Tails and the rest of the Sonic gang help. But whatever. In this fight, you switch between modern and classic Sonic to fight the Time Eater, pretty much dividing this fight into 2 main phases between both Hedgehogs. The first phase has you battle classic Eggman as classic Sonic in a traditional 2D side-scroller type of way. Here you move up, down, left, and right to avoid punches, projectiles, and beams. You can also use the analog stick on the 3DS to move classic Sonic around the screen, which feels a lot more natural and satisfying. My main gripe with this phase is that it's so fucking boring. You literally just move around the screen to avoid attacks and counterattack when the game tells you to. Classic Sonic has no special moves or attacks. Even if you have the homing attack equipped, you still can't use it. I know it's supposed to be akin to the classic 2D Sonic games, but it's fucking lame. You're kinda just moving around waiting for things to happen, and nothing you do can speed up the process. Phase 2, however, is where things get a lot more interesting though. Here you take control of modern Sonic and move around in a pseudo 3D environment, which feels like how a final supersonic boss fight should be. Your goal is to reach the Time Eater by boosting towards him, all while collecting rings, avoiding obstacles and projectiles, and avoiding Eggman's attacks, which must be avoided by Supersonic's dash attack, which you also use to damage the Time Eater. I would argue that this version of the boss fight against the Time Eater is both more engaging and entertaining than the one on console. For example, you actually have to avoid the Time Eater's attacks in order to reach him. When the Time Eater's hands appear, it can actually be a bit challenging avoiding his hands since you have to dodge both vertically and horizontally depending on the positioning of his hands. Plus your reaction speed needs to be quick, since he gets faster and faster the further you get into this fight and the closer you get to him during this phase. Dodging his projectiles and clock hands attack can also be a challenge, as if you get hit, you are flung backwards and have to make up for lost time, all while your ring count is dwindling down. Or, when you finally reach him, you have to avoid his final attack in order to reach his core and damage him as modern Sonic. Like, you actually have to play the game to beat this. Unlike the console versions of Sonic Generations, where you basically just hold down the boost button and maybe occasionally tilt the analog stick up or down in order to reach the Time Eater. The only thing that this fight lacks is the super cool moment where both modern and classic Sonic clash against the giant death ball that the Time Eater launches at you, which looks like it came out of Frieza's ass crack. If that moment were here in the 3DS version of the game, it would have honestly ranked a bit higher for me since I love cinematic endings in my supersonic boss fights. Overall, despite everything I bitched about, this fight lands itself into A tier solely because of modern Sonic sections, which to me are a lot of fun and make up for the lackluster variety in the rest of this fight. It was a great way to change things up from the rest of the bosses, and modern Sonic sections make this fight feel right at home like a true supersonic final boss battle. But yeah, while the graphics and spectacles do obviously look so much better than the 3DS, the gameplay and cinematic moments are lacking on console. The 3DS boss fights are mostly what you'd expect, and take full advantage of what the 3DS has to offer. For example, the rival races are very arcade-like. They're meant to be short and to be played a bunch of times in order to practice taking all the optimal pathways in order to get an S rank and a high score. The rival fights on console seem to want to take a more cinematic approach, kinda like what we see in Shadow's new boss battle in Sonic X Shadow Generations, but fall short in the base game of Sonic Generations for a variety of reasons. Both boss fights in both games have their pros and cons. but I do think the boss battles in Sonic Generations for the 3DS hit the mark a bit better for their creativity and landing on all fours when it comes to the expectations people have from a handheld game. Whereas most of the boss fights on the console versions of Sonic Generations seem to be a bit underwhelming and don't really take full advantage of what a reimagining boss fight should be or could be from previous Sonic titles. Anywho, I hope you guys enjoyed the video and my lengthy ramblings on a talking blue hedgehog. Thank you all so much for supporting part 1 of this video where I talk about the boss fights from the console versions of Sonic Generations. A link will be provided on screen and in the description for that video for those who want to check it out. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe for more Sonic the Hedgehog content in the future. And until then, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.